Deorr was a 2-year-old boy who disappeared at Timber Creek Campground in Idaho on July 10th of 2015 under very mysterious conditions. I go over those conditions and the years of controversy that follow in previous videos on my page, so you should go check those out to get a better understanding of what happened. But in this video, I'm going to go over the various theories of what happened and discuss the merits of each theory depending on the information available to the public. But this is actually where your help would be great, because I have been up to my eyeballs in this case, and I think that a fresher mind is sometimes helpful in these situations. So let me know in the comments what you find that supports or discredits which theories. With that, let's get into it. Here are the theories I will be discussing, and in this order. 1. Abduction by a human. 2. Animal attack. 3. Deorr wandered off on his own and died. 4. Deorr's parents accidentally killed him. 5. Deorr's parents sold him. 6. Deorr's parents intentionally killed him. And 7. Isaac, Grandpa Bob's friend, killed him and covered it up. Okay, first up, Deorr was kidnapped, abducted by another human. So here's the campground. You see Forest Road 172 to the right of the campground, or kind of east. And then going southwest, it leads past the reservoir to another campground, and then further into the wilderness where it turns into a dead end. 172 links up with 172A and heads back to civilization going northeast, if you look up northeast there on the map. This is the main road, 172, they took until it branched off to 172A to get to the campground. I know Google Maps says there's a campground closer to the reservoir, but apparently that little loop is the actual campground, so ignore what Google Maps says here. Like I said, you have 172A, that leads to the campground. 172B is on the other side of the Middle Fork Little Timber Creek. Then the main road, 172, is about 8 to 9 miles to the campsite from the main road, and it's unpaved and rocky. So I just really wanted to explain this to you guys so we can dive into all these kidnapping scenarios, because there are actually a few different scenarios in which Deorr could have been kidnapped, because we have 3 roads and they're leading in different directions. So for a kidnapping to have occurred, someone would have had to lie in waiting somewhere to steal Deorr away within the 5 to 25 minute time period that he was allegedly left alone and not with his parents or with Grandpa Bob. And they would have had to steal him from a very small area because the parents were at the creek, which was very close to the campground, around 50 yards. And you can see in the photo where that creek is, it's pretty close. Now, Vernal had some things to say about the campsite, and I think it's worth listening to so we can get a better understanding of like how it looked.
And I didn't know, it's very open, but you can't see much. There's a road that goes up and along the top, we're camped underneath the reservoir, basically right below it. And you can go up above the reservoir, and I didn't even know the road was up there. And as I traveled up there myself, I come to find out I can see everything going on in that campsite, but you can't see out. You can't see up, you can't see around, and if anybody comes to the bottom of your campground, you can't even see who they are.
So they could have come into your campground.
They could have came in and you couldn't never know it. And with the water was not a fast running, it's a creek, but it is quite loud moving through the logs and things like that. So hearing range is not all that far either. So if you couldn't hear anybody coming up either.
So he was just...
Now, that video is in relation to Vernal's abduction theory. Here, he was implying that a kidnapper could have been surveilling the campsite and come down to take Deorr. Now, you can look at the terrain of the area. It seems he was referring to Forest Road 172B. We have incline there, and it creates a bit of a plateau. This would mean someone was up there and was surveilling them and had seen when the parents split off from Deorr. The thing is, if that was the case, the parents in the creek would have been in between the kidnapper and Deorr. So the kidnapper would have had to run down the decline, gone over the creek, around the parents, grabbed Deorr, avoided Grandpa Bob's sight, and then run back around the parents, through the creek, up the incline, got in his car, and run away, or her car, and run off. All within a 5 to 25 minute time period. Not only is that highly improbable and very hard to pull off, you're also telling me that Deorr made no noise, no boots were dropped, no clothing, nothing was ripped, nothing? Well, Vernal also said that the creek was loud enough to potentially drown out the sound of a car approaching. That would mean someone would have had to arrive by Forest Road 172A. While physically not as impossible as the other kidnapping theory, I don't see how a kidnapper would have known in advance that the parents would have lost track of Deorr for 5 to 25 minutes and then snuck in to grab him, especially with 2 other adults involved. What if Isaac showed up? What about Grandpa Bob? In this scenario, the kidnapper does not have a vantage point to even know that Deorr was separated from the adults or where any of the adults were. Then, we also have the lack of noise, no boots lost, no articles of clothing, no blood, etc. Just very unlikely. Now, maybe Deorr did wander off a bit, and he specifically wandered on to the road, the 172A loop. And by chance, someone who also happened to want to kidnap a child was driving around that loop, saw him, and just impromptu grabbed him. Honestly, of all these possibilities of how Deorr was kidnapped, I actually think this would be the most probable. But still insanely low on that probability. Highly unlikely. Because the number of chances and coincidences that have to happen for that to occur just makes it very improbable. And also, here's the kicker. Outside of my own analysis that I just gave to you guys, law enforcement sees this as not at all a possibility. It didn't happen, they say. Not only that, the first 2 private investigators initially actually thought that this was the potential answer, and then after investigating further, decided totally against it. And then on top of that, even if the last scenario I gave you was a potential scenario of what happened, you have to stack it up against all the inconsistencies in the parents' stories. Now, once you do that, it seems less likely than any other theory. So the next one is Deorr was the victim of a wild animal attack. Let's dive into wild animals in Idaho and which ones might be found at this campsite. Idaho is known for grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, and cougars. The grizzly bears are found more in the northern and eastern areas of Idaho, whereas black bears are found throughout. Now, Timber Creek Campground is definitely not super far north when you're thinking of Idaho as a state, but it is on the eastern side more so. So maybe grizzly bears are found there. I'm not really sure, to be honest. We also have to consider that this campground is in a pretty remote area. The camp is 8 to 9 miles down an unpaved rocky road into the wilderness. This does increase the chance that someone would run into a wild animal, such as a black bear, a grizzly bear, or otherwise. That being said, bears aren't necessarily social animals. I have actually run into black bears myself while camping, and if you make noise, they will run away. Unless, of course, you're getting in between them and their cubs. In that case, you're screwed. But if not, you'll probably be okay. Grizzly bears, on the other hand, they're a lot worse. But again, they're known to avoid humans. I don't think one would walk across this campsite and nab a child. So, like I said, bears, it's possible they were there. I think is pretty low. As for wolves, they travel in packs and are more nocturnal. I don't really see an entire pack of wolves converging on this campsite in the middle of the day and then quietly stealing a child. And I also don't see a lone wolf doing that either. Wolves are pack animals. So I actually think that the biggest danger would be a mountain lion. Cougars don't distinguish between humans and deer and elk, and they've been known to eat children. The thing is that they're actually very elusive, and they're very rare to come across, especially near an occupied campsite. So again, I'm not super sold on this idea either. And overall, I actually think this theory that an animal attack occurred and that's what happened to Deorr is very low on the probability scale. The chance that an animal would happen across the campsite and quietly take a child away from that area within a 5 to 25 minute time period without any commotion is super low. And the parents were adamant about Deorr's boots being too big for him. And so somehow the boots didn't fall off. There was no screaming, no struggle, no blood within a 3.5 mile radius, which is the radius that they searched when Deorr went missing. It just doesn't check out. And that's from my analysis. You then look at the sheriff's department and private investigators. They also say that's not what happened. You also have a lot of evidence stacked up against the parents that really outweighs this theory. But we're going to get into that later. So overall, like I said, very low on the list. Probably didn't happen. Third theory, Deorr wandered off on his own and passed away. So one question is, did he die a water death? We do have a creek, we have a reservoir. What happened there? That's very unlikely. Search and rescue were exhaustive in their search of the creek and reservoir. They had divers, boats with sonar, etc. They were apparently taking chainsaws to logs in the creek to try see if he got caught underwater in a bunch of debris or something. They were completely unable to find any body or any articles of clothing or evidence that Deorr ever slipped away, drowned, or got lost in any capacity. And he really could not have gone far. They searched in a 3.5-mile radius. He was wearing boots too big for him. He was 2 years old. Even walking in a perfectly straight line with like 0 incline, so it was easier for him to walk at a faster pace, he could not have gone far. We could combine some of these theories here and say, okay, he got far enough away that an animal could have grabbed him and then his cries were unheard, and then, the animal made off with him. Now that makes 2 theories, the wild animal attack and the wandering off theory, both more probable. But we are still running into the issue of the lack of evidence. No blood, no clothing left behind, nothing. We also know that Deorr was not the kind of child to wander off. He was glued to his mom. Another way this could have happened is he wandered into a cave somewhere and starved. But again, the search and rescue was so extensive, I can't imagine they just walk past the cave and not look inside. You'd obviously probably be like, oh my gosh, there's a cave. Maybe the child's inside the cave. And even if they had missed him the first go-around, there have been many, many searches since with cadaver dogs. It seems unlikely his body would have gone unnoticed. Deorr was also deeply attached to his mother, as observed by other people, such as his grandmother, Tina Clegg. And as observed by the parents themselves, he was not the type to run off. Watch.
Yeah, especially after screaming his name, we have nicknames for him. No sound of him.
This little
no
boy
crying.
is not. He's a goer and a mover, but he does not go away from his parents. He does not.
Yeah, he's very
So
attached
this
to
is
us.
very unusual.
Very, very unusual, sir.
And
In addition, this theory is not supported by the private investigators or law enforcement. So I think this is maybe the lowest probability of all of the theories so far, but we'll keep going and we'll see. Theory 4. The parents accidentally killed him and covered it up. This theory, in my opinion, is more credible than any of the previous 3 theories. We have evidence of blood found in the back wheel well and the back bumper of the truck. Now, the FBI has looked at it and they said it was inconclusive, so we don't know if it's Deorr's. But we also know that Vernal has told a story where he was at the campsite working on his truck to some degree, and Deorr was running around the back of the truck and he stuck his arm in the tailpipe and also pointed out something was missing from the back wheel, that something was that was a lug nut. It is possible that Vernal maybe accidentally backed up into Deorr and, in panic, they all covered it up. And was alcohol potentially involved? Isaac did mention Grandpa Bob had brought alcohol on the trip. This could then be considered vehicular manslaughter. In Idaho, the penalties for grossly negligent vehicular manslaughter could be up to 10 years in prison and or a maximum fine of $10,000. Negligent vehicular manslaughter in Idaho could be up to 1 year in jail and or up to $2,000 in fines. We know the parents were in some financial trouble already, and Vernal's occupation was a truck driver, so he would likely lose his job as well, potentially forever. In a panic, maybe they covered up the scene. Okay, but what about the trip to town, where the parents are adamant that they had Deorr interacting with many different witnesses, and then those witnesses said they saw nothing? Did the accident occur before the trip to town? Because that's probably what happened. And then the trip was to hide Deorr's body? Okay, but then what about the creek incident after the trip to town? Why is everyone confused about what happened when people went to the fishing holes? Why did Vernal lie about driving 1.5 miles to call 911? Why, in Jessica's written statement, is she 1 second at camp and Vernal's 1.5 miles away calling 911, and then the next sentence, she's sitting in the passenger seat with Vernal in the same truck? That whole situation does not add up. Also, are Grandpa Bob and Isaac in on it then? Or did the parents cover it up from them as well? I guess you could say, okay, the accident occurred before the trip to town. The trip was to hide the body, and the confusion is because the lying and the covering up is the creek story, and no one got their story straight because it's a cover-up. But when we look at the written statement, there is way more tension around the creek portion of the story. The pre-town trip actually seems relatively peaceful, not like a child died. Yeah, we have inconsistencies, but let's take a look at Vernal's written statement. His writing becomes way more chaotic and he scribbles out more details as the creek scene occurs. Here is his writing when discussing the scene prior to town. An understandable number of scribbles and mistakes for someone writing in pen while in an emotional state after the disappearance of their child. Now look at the creek story. Way more stress. Let's break this down. If they accidentally killed Deorr before the trip, then you'd expect chaos in the writing before the trip to occur, some kind of stress, but there is none. Instead, we see stress during the creek story. Now, one could argue that this story is stressful because that's when Deorr went missing, but we don't know why he went missing. The animal attack and kidnapping theories don't hold much weight. One could also argue that, well, they are using the creek story to cover up the accidental homicide that occurred before the trip. So they are stressed about the creek story because it's a lie. Okay, but the testimony prior to the trip would also be a lie then. So why aren't they stressed about the story before the trip, but suddenly they're stressed about the creek? That doesn't make much sense. In addition, what about Isaac and Bob? Why is Isaac's story so consistent? Is Bob also lying through his teeth about what happened? Although maybe Bob and Isaac weren't there at the time of the accident, so they had no idea what happened. But we have no evidence that they weren't there before the town trip. The only time where everyone was split up is when people were or weren't going to the creek. So maybe an accidental homicide occurred when they were going to the creek? But how? The private investigators and law enforcement put more weight on this theory, and it's further backed by the fact that both the parents failed multiple polygraph tests. So it seems that an accidental homicide is pretty high on the list of possibilities of what happened to Baby Deorr. Now we're going to talk about the fifth theory, which is that the parents purposefully killed him. There's a lot of overlap here with the previous theory, except that it's a cover-up of an intentional homicide rather than an accidental homicide. First, no one outside of the individuals on the trip remember seeing Deorr. Now, some people claim he actually never even made it to the campsite. Something happened before they even got there. We do know that Jessica took no photos of Deorr once at the campsite, and allegedly she was an avid photo taker of her and Deorr. So that's pretty suspicious. But also, it's a nature getaway. Maybe she didn't want to be on her phone, and that's actually what she said when asked about this. In addition, law enforcement doesn't really support the claim that Deorr never made it to the mountain, mainly because Isaac is so adamant about Deorr being at the campsite, and the fact that Isaac's story is the only consistent one, so they think Isaac is telling the truth. And given his developmental challenges, I'm not sure he would even be the greatest liar. It seems law enforcement also came to that conclusion. This means the death would have had to occur once everyone was at the campsite. A lot of people, similar to the accident theory, think that Deorr was killed prior to the trip to town, or maybe during that trip to town. His body was hidden somewhere on that trip, and the parents made up the creek story to make it seem like he was kidnapped. But Isaac is very staunch in his opinion that Deorr came back from the town trip. Now, a potential theory could be that Isaac genuinely believes that Deorr may have come back. Maybe Vernal mentioned Deorr was sitting in his car seat in the back, and when in reality, Deorr was not even there, and Isaac had no reason to think otherwise. And that would check out with Isaac's memory of the events, because Vernal apparently hung back with Deorr while Isaac went off to show Jessica the fishing hole. That would give him the perfect opportunity to act like there was some kind of miscommunication with Grandpa Bob, and Isaac would believe Deorr was always there, and then they could just claim that Deorr was kidnapped or he got lost. We also potentially have some motive here. We know the parents were under financial stress. Children are costly. We also have a history of Jessica giving up full custody of 2 previous children to an ex-husband because, according to her, it was a better financial setup. In addition, Jessica's own mother, in an interview with private investigator Klein, said this.
Do you think she was trying to do one of two things? Was she just tired of kids, or was she trying to do the ultimate protection?
My opinion.
Or a 50-50?
My opinion is that Jess wanted to be kind of free to run with Deorr.
So maybe she also didn't want kids to begin with. She saw Deorr as a burden, and maybe Vernal was right there with her on that belief. Now, I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think the motive is pretty weak here. So that hurts the possibility of this theory. It also doesn't explain the chaos of the creek or the weird lying about driving off to make the 911 call. We could dive into the theory that Deorr was killed after the town trip, but we still have the weirdness around the fact that no one saw Deorr in the town despite what Jessica and Vernal allege. And how did they hide Deorr's body? That place was searched extensively. Nothing was found, and they would have had to hide the body in that area if Deorr wasn't killed until after the trip to town. And it has continued to be searched since. Nothing has come up. So where in the world did they hide the body? So those are some things that call into question this theory, but then we also have some additional support, which is the fact that the parents did fail numerous polygraph tests. But It also could be because Deorr accidentally was killed. It was an accidental homicide, and that's why they're lying about things. We don't really know. In addition, having an elderly man who struggles with mobility and health, as well as someone with developmental disabilities at the campsite with you during the occurrence of a crime, that actually could be two great alibis. Very easy to fool. But pushing back against that assessment is the fact that allegedly this was an impromptu camping trip, and it was Grandpa Bob's idea to go on the trip. Although maybe it was a last-minute decision to kill Deorr, and that would explain the insane chaos and inconsistency of everything. It wasn't very planned out. And the fact that Grandpa and Isaac were there were just helpful for the parents, but not necessarily planned. It was coincidental. Maybe that's what helped convince them to kill Deorr, having alibis that were easy to fool or hide stuff from. But again, that's a lot of like maybe this, maybe that, and it's very tenuous, in my opinion. So while I think a homicide may be at the top of theories, I don't know if an intentional homicide is more convincing than an accidental homicide. Now, this next theory is very interesting, and it's actually a theory that the first private investigator really believed, and might still believe to this day, that Deorr was sold or adopted out. And I've read some stuff that says Jessica did this on her own with no help or knowledge from Vernal or anyone else. Let's start with just the idea that Deorr was adopted out. Both Jessica and Vernal were in on it. It's kind of a similar analysis to the previous theory, so I'll keep it short. But one could argue that they sold Deorr on that initial trip to town. It would explain why no witnesses saw him on that trip. It wasn't actually to get feminine products, it was to give Deorr away. But everything I have already said really points in a different direction. There's not much chaos in discussing the trip to town, but there's a lot of chaos with the creek incident. Now again, maybe that chaos is related to the fact that it's a fake story, but the stress and inconsistencies involved in that story makes me think something actually happened at that time. The 911 call also just really sticks out to me. And again, Isaac really believes Deorr came back from that trip to town. And the idea that Jessica did this on own, I don't see any support for that. I have no idea how Jessica could have snuck away and sold Deorr without anyone knowing. She was pretty much always with at least one other adult. And when she was alone, like when she went to the restroom on the trip to town, Deorr was with Vernal. And I don't know how Jessica could then manufacture the entire creek situation on her own. Overall, I give this theory a very low probability, both from Jessica doing it or the parents doing it together. And then again, you add the whole fact that this was impromptu. How do you set up an adoption if this was an impromptu camp situation and it was Grandpa Bob's idea? Like, I just don't see how that happened. Okay, and we're gonna go into the final theory. We will discuss whether Isaac is to blame for Deorr's disappearance. This is an interesting one, that he killed Deorr and then covered it up. It's interesting because in Klein's interviews, it seems Jessica and Vernal started to really point at Isaac as being suspicious and potentially involved in the disappearance of their son. Grandpa Bob also expressed a lack of trust in Isaac. Take a look.
Isaac. Well, Isaac's a weirdo. Isaac, does this. Isaac does that.
I never really got a feel for him, like his personality. He really didn't talk to us. Really kind of was just odd.
They keep bringing up Isaac, and he's creepy, and he's weird, and he's odd.
I said, when you came walking up to camp, did you see my son? Did you cross paths? The response I got pissed me off. Because he said, and I quote, I don't know. I looked at him, and I said, when is the last time you seen my son? And again, I got, I don't know. And I said, you better start knowing something real fast.
Do you trust Isaac?
But for what? I mean,
Would you trust him to spend the night in your house?
no,
Would you trust him to watch your grandson?
no,
Do you trust him to not steal your money?
no.
Why are you friends with him? If you don't trust him, why would you?
Well, you know what? That's a hell of a question.
You're right.
I had my eye on what was going on all the time.
Vernal also at another point in time kept saying that his dog Missy did not like Isaac. We also have a very weird and suspicious fact that Isaac factory reset his phone 3 times once he found out that the law enforcement was going to show up. That's very suspicious. Maybe Isaac walked Jessica to the fishing holes. We know that he left Jessica and walked towards camp, and then he also disappeared to go fishing. Did he grab Deorr on that way and make off with him? But we have a video of Bob saying that he saw Isaac right around the time Deorr went missing, and Deorr wasn't with Isaac. And in the video I just showed you guys, Vernal himself says he saw Isaac right when he realized Deorr was missing. So again, if Deorr was missing, but he saw Isaac, then how would Isaac have kidnapped Deorr or killed him? There was no time to do that. And how would he have run off to hide the body? And we know he didn't take a car to do it. He didn't have a car. That wasn't even an option for him. I've read elsewhere that he did disappear for a while during the main search for Deorr before 911 was called. But again, Deorr went missing before he wandered off because Vernal and Grandpa Bob saw him. And I don't know how Isaac could have ran off and hit a body in the time between Vernal last saw him and the 911 call. And again, we have other theories that are stronger because the evidence points elsewhere, away from Isaac. Yeah, it's very weird that Isaac did a factory reset 3 times once he found out that law enforcement would be showing up. But maybe he was scared law enforcement would find something else on his phone. Maybe there's something else there that's not related to Deorr that he doesn't want the police to see. Because Isaac's testimony, it is the only consistent one, and KIC Texas found him to be truthful. So it seems like he's one of the least suspicious actors in this situation. And then you have to consider, there's zero motive. Isaac met Deorr for the first time on this trip. And again, we still have the continual switching of stories from the parents. Failing the polygraph test, the crazy 911 call, lying about driving to a new location to make the call. It goes on and on. So yeah, you have Isaac with consistency, with one suspicious, very suspicious thing, but then you have a ton of inconsistency on the parent side. I just give this theory very low on probability of being the reason why Deorr disappeared. I would say it's maybe tied with the wild animal attacks and Deorr just wandering off, or maybe a smidge higher. And that's just because I don't trust people and you never know what they're gonna do. And so I kind of put people at a little more dangerous situation than, an animal or Deorr hiding off or running off. But overall, low chances happened. That means I would put the accidental or purposeful homicide theories at the top. Probably tied, maybe accidental a little above intentional, because to believe parents would intentionally kill their child is really far-fetched. And we don't have a ton of evidence that there was much motive. So I would say accidental. Right beneath it, we have intentional homicide. I would then say maybe the parents agreeing to adopt him out would be below that. That's definitely possible. I think it could have happened. And then I would put the kidnapping would be below that, but not much farther below. I would then put Isaac. And then the wild animal attack theory would tie at the bottom with Deorr wandering off and just dying. But really, the last 5 theories after the 2 homicidal theories are practically tied just at the very, very bottom, like way down at the bottom. So that's how I would analyze this. Now, there are some other theories out there. I've not gone into them. These are the main ones. So that's it. The main theories on this case of what happened to Deorr on July 10th in 2015. Like I said, I've been wading through this case for a while now, and I have consumed an insane amount of information. So I would love to hear your guys' opinion on the credibility of these various theories. Or if you have a different theory yourself, please share it. And if I missed something, let me know. Now, I said this in the beginning of my deep dive on this case. Sergio Denaro is actually doing an analysis of the various testimonies and interviews and written statements on and he has his own theory that he will be putting forth in his own video. So I highly encourage you to subscribe to his channel. It's Truth Revealed by SD, and watch that video because he actually comes to conclusions that I have heard nowhere else. And he has a theory that I did not include on this list. But with his background and expertise, I think he brings a very valuable analysis to the case that we should all take into consideration. So, with all of that, I want to thank you guys for accompanying me on this very long roller coaster. And I hope my work on this case will draw more attention to Deorr and maybe actually help solve it one day so that we can put him and his family and those who care about him at ease. So, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.